Welcome to The Debate. Today, we are wrestling with a distinctly modern dilemma, one that really forces us to question the nature of memory and, well, authenticity in this digital age. This tension becomes particularly apparent, I think, during those moments when we seek genuine connection with the world around us, like, the annual migration for apple picking or the search for perfect autumn foliage. We're talking about the nearly irresistible compulsion to digitally document every single experience we have.
Yeah, it's that instant the phone comes out, isn't it? That's the moment the participant becomes the chronicler, and the whole experience just shifts its gravitational pull.
Psychological and sensory loss that the person documenting the moment experiences, basically robbing them of the memory itself? Or is it the deeper, maybe more structurally damaging corruption of shared reality caused by, the digital manipulation of the resulting image or video?
Hmm. Both are definitely significant cultural forces, yeah. But the nature and scope of the damage they inflict are, I think, profoundly different.
I'm going to argue today that the foundational issue is the loss of the lived experience itself. This results in what psychologists are starting to call secondhand memories. The moment is diminished, perhaps permanently, the instant we trade presence for performance.
Okay, and I'll be arguing that while that sensory loss is regrettable, sure, on an individual level, the greater, more systemic harm lies in the pervasive requirement for inauthenticity and reality bending that's become like mandatory for validation within our digital systems. We are collectively suffering from a manufactured reality.
Right. I see why you emphasize the systemic problem, but let me circle back to the immediate psychological cost, which I really believe is the genesis of all the subsequent problems. My core thesis is that the simple, unadorned act of documenting fundamentally shifts our attention from absorbing the environment around us, the sensory input that creates true memory, to merely capturing it for external consumption. And this trade-off, it drastically diminishes the quality of the memory and the overall sensory richness of the experience.
You're describing that feeling, yeah, of being a spectator in one's own life. But I think maybe you underestimate the resilience of human memory sometimes.
Well, I disagree on that, because the evidence seems to point to a genuine failure of presence. Just consider the vivid scene described in the material, standing in a glorious apple orchard, supposedly soaking up autumn's beauty, yet everyone is hunched over their phones. They're acting as spectators, right? Their eyes glued to a 6-inch screen, previewing a moment they are ostensibly living. The goal shifts from, say, savoring the crisp scent of the air to optimizing the angle of the shot. This division of attention is just destructive. We have documented accounts of people taking like 137 photos of the exact same maple tree, only to later realize they couldn't recall simple core details: the distinct smell of the damp leaves, the exact feeling of the cool wind against their face.
That inability to access rich sensory detail in later recall, that's powerful testimony to the cost of distraction. I grant you that.
It is, because our brains kind of treat the device as an external hard drive. We outsource the memory-keeping process, which leads to those secondhand memories. We end up remembering the mechanical process of framing and taking the photo rather than the moment itself. This is the practical manifestation of the cost of partial attention. The brain is simply incapable of fully encoding a rich, immersive experience when its resources are split between living it and, well, turning it into content. The very focus on capturing content poisons the well of genuine experience.
That's a powerful argument focused on the internal trauma, the personal loss. However, I come at this from a completely different angle, prioritizing the external, the structural trauma. While I absolutely acknowledge the sensory loss is unfortunate, the greater, ongoing harm lies in what happens after the photo is taken, once it enters the, frankly, unforgiving system of digital validation. My core thesis is that the pervasive requirement for inauthenticity is structurally destructive, creating this mandatory digital performance that poisons cultural truths.
So you pivot from the distraction to the subsequent deception.
Exactly. The pressure applied by these platforms isn't merely to document, it is to perfect the documentation to an absolutely unattainable standard. The digital tools, the airbrushing, the filters, the outright changes to the fundamental physics of the image, they force an unnatural, homogenized reality that simply does not exist. We see evidence of this extreme manipulation everywhere. It creates what the material calls airbrush city, where the acceptable standard of beauty for women is defined by, frankly, impossible alterations, pinching the waist, radically altering the hip-to-waist ratio, and crucially, this isn't limited to static images anymore. It extends to video content, thanks to the rise of AI applications. The new Metal Blender video, for instance, is an alarming demonstration of how easily motion and physique can be edited and manipulated post hoc.
Okay, but those egregious distortions are applied to an experience that has already been made shallow by the initial act of filming, wouldn't you say?
They are distortions applied to reality itself, and they are not optional if you want validation online. The cycle is driven by intense social and often financial incentive, where extreme manipulation results in the absolute insanity of high engagement, sometimes reaching 1.5 million likes. This means the digital lie is rewarded, like exponentially. The problem is no longer just an individual missing a beautiful sunset. It is the widespread communal destruction of the baseline truth of what a body looks like, what a real crowd size is. Think about the use of Photoshop clone stamps to fake larger attendance at events, or even what a pregnant woman's silhouette can realistically be. The goal is strategic deception, and the currency is attention.
Let's address that critical cultural shift then, focusing on the link between the initial compulsion and the eventual fakery. You argue that the deception is the primary harm. I understand that position deeply, I do, but I still maintain that the demand for performance, that modern mantra of pics or it didn't happen, that is the fundamental cultural shift that transforms private lived experience into public, sellable content. This compulsion is the precursor to the filtering. The need for external validation taints the initial experience, making it shallow before a single filter is even applied. The choice to document, in my view, is the original sin here.
That's an interesting point, though I would frame it differently. The cultural demand for perfection is what validates the fakery, giving the systemic illness its power. Yes, the initial psychological harm of distraction is real. I concede that. But the structural harm is that the acceptable standard for shared reality is now a manipulated reality. The consequence is far, far more damaging than just a few lost personal memories. We are actively destroying the baseline truth for every viewer, and this creates deep-seated cultural pathology, from body dysmorphia across both men's fitness and general beauty standards to the complete decoupling of digital presence from physical reality.
But if we concede that the experience is primarily filtered through the screen because the primary goal has been externalized to create content, doesn't that actually support the importance of reclaiming the internal experience first? The irony is just acute. People travel to experience autumn's beauty, but interact with it primarily through these 6-inch screens. If the moment itself was truly, profoundly absorbing, the initial urge for immediate external validation would surely be significantly reduced.
That speaks to the hope of personal change, and I get that. But we have to prioritize the ethical and structural implications because the harm is multiplicative. We're really discussing two forms of harm here: self-sabotage, missing one's own sensory life, and shared delusion, believing an impossible, manipulated image. The shared delusion is far more toxic and lasting to the culture at large because it sets a false standard that forces every subsequent participant to lie just to keep up.
So, if we accept that the primary problem is a systemic disease driven by these external incentives, what is the practical, personal remedy? I still maintain that the solution has to begin internally, with reclaiming the fully immersive sensory experiences, the undocumented, unfiltered, and entirely yours moment. That's the only true one. Practical steps like designating phone-free periods during high-value activities or maybe enforcing the one-and-done photo rule aren't just personal hacks. They are profound acts of resistance against this spectator's dilemma. They are attempts to prioritize the feeling of cool air and the taste of fresh cider over the clarity of a perfectly composed photo.
I'm sorry, but I just don't buy that such personal techniques can really counter such a massive structural pressure.
Those steps are individual remedies for what is essentially a global systemic pathology. The problem isn't primarily that you took too many photos. The problem is that the entire digital environment demands you lie about yourself and your surroundings to be deemed worthy of attention. The prevalence of filtering and alteration is so extreme that it applies even to the most established figures. Consider the materials comparison between filtered celebrities like Madonna attempting to look perpetually 30 and figures like Cillian Murphy, who are appreciated precisely because their images are often left unfiltered and reflective of reality.
But doesn't that stark contrast just highlight the individual's power to resist the performance imperative?
No, I think it emphasizes the intensity of the pressure to conform. And this pressure is not just self-inflicted, it is externally enforced. The fact that individuals sometimes resort to extreme physical alterations and even editing of other people in photos. Remember the example of the individual who heavily filtered himself but conspicuously left his colleague untouched in the same gym photo? That shows the pathology is external and competitive. It's driven by the intense need to maintain an impossible digital facade, often requiring you to make others look worse by comparison just to elevate your own edited self. No amount of self-imposed phone limits addresses that deeply pathological external incentive structure. And this brings us squarely to the true impact of technology's rapid evolution. The advance of the tools themselves, from simple color saturation filters way back when, to applications now that literally change the physics of pictures, fundamentally altering waist-to-hip ratios and body mass. That is the most obnoxious development because it makes the dishonesty easy and almost invisible. This profound capacity for egregious alterations is what truly warps culture and breeds societal distrust, far more than the simple distraction of taking a basic snapshot ever could.
That's a compelling argument regarding the downstream effect of technology, sure. But have you considered that the distraction is the necessary gateway? The documented moments that are later edited, filtered, and twisted. They are already shallower connections, precisely because the initial experience was compromised. If we were truly present, savoring the specific golden quality of light, the crisp scent of leaves, we wouldn't experience the moment with such a lack of satisfaction that we feel the need for photographic evidence just to validate that the experience even occurred. Eliminating that initial existential need for validation is what removes the pressure to later falsify that evidence for social currency.
It requires everyone to participate in the lie. The harm becomes exponential. If I miss the smell of the apple orchard, okay, that's regrettable. That's my personal sensory loss. But if 1.5 million people look at an image that demonstrably alters physical reality and begin to internalize that impossibility as the standard, that is a collective structural loss of truth that impacts mental health, economic standards, and frankly, cultural cohesion.
The courage to live unwitnessed. I think that's the ultimate remedy against the compulsion to perform. The source material suggests that the most authentic experience is one that lives only in your memory, undocumented, unfiltered, and entirely yours. That intentional choice negates both the initial distraction and the subsequent pressure to falsify. We have to demand presence of ourselves first.
And I insist that while self-reclamation is laudable, absolutely, it does not dismantle the system that forces others to lie or that floods our collective consciousness with untruth. We must be fully aware that the contemporary systems of cultural and social validation are now fundamentally built on organized deception. That pathology requires a structural critique before individual mindfulness can really take hold and make a difference on a larger scale.
Okay, so in summarizing my position, I maintain that the core struggle facing the individual in the modern world is reclaiming presence over performance. The most valuable memories, the truly enduring ones, are the purely sensory ones. The specific golden quality of light, the satisfying crunch of gravel underfoot, the unique taste of pressed cider. These are details that no filter, no lens, and no amount of attention splitting can truly capture or preserve. We must prioritize absorbing the moment over documentation, recognizing that the act of documentation inherently cheapens the experience it seeks to immortalize.
And in summarizing mine, I believe the most damaging element is the pervasive, almost mandatory inauthenticity. The validation loop in digital spaces demands that shared content is often, frankly, a lie.
Whether the subject is beauty standards, crowd sizes, or basic physics, the structural incentive is to play yourself by changing reality. While we certainly regret the lost sensory experiences, I do too, the communal damage caused by manufacturing and propagating an impossible reality is the more urgent and culturally destructive problem we face.
We have certainly deeply illuminated the profound tension here between seeking a genuine, fully engaged connection to the season or to any moment, really, and seeking the fleeting external validation of others.
Indeed. And it leaves us with that core reflection drawn from our material, a question I think we all must ask ourselves. In our urgent rush to prove that we were there, are we perhaps forgetting how to simply be there?